The earth holds many secrets. Beneath the rich farmland of northwestern Iowa, along the banks of the Little Sioux River, recent archaeological investigations yielded an enlightening description of at least 3 ancient cultures of hunting and gathering people who, at different times in the past, lived in this area. The Cherokee Suicide was discovered accidentally in 1973 during the construction of sewage treatment facilities near the town of Cherokee, Iowa. Preliminary testing established the presence of at least 3 distinct cultural layers dated about 6,300, 7,400, and 8,500 years ago. It was also established that the area probably functioned as both a hunting camp and as a site where the carcasses of animals killed on a hunt were butchered. In 1976, to follow up what had initially been an emergency salvage project, a team of specialists, assisted by students enrolled in the University of Iowa Field School, began an intensive interdisciplinary investigation of the site with the hope of reconstructing the climate, environment, and culture of the past 9,000 years.
The first decision that we really had to make was whether or not enough of the site remained to warrant organizing a salvage effort. Fortunately, the way it turned out, we decided to attempt some limited salvage in an undisturbed portion of the site near the road. This led to the use of some heavy equipment and the discovery of the cultural layer that we now call Horizon 1. Subsequently, deeper testing led to the recognition of the older cultural horizons that we are now investigating.
We came back for the original text excavation for 2 weeks in August 1973 when we used an end-loader and a large backhoe. During this period of time, we discovered Horizon 2 and 3 because it's a common premise of archaeology that you don't stop going down until you're sure you've run out of culture or you've hit bedrock and can go no farther. We were quite fortunate at that time in discovering Horizons 2 and 3. When we came back this year, we knew we had to make more extensive use of the heavy equipment and open up a good deal more of the site than we did previously, and again we have been quite fortunate. We opened up several more areas of what we call Horizon 1 and Horizon 2, and as you've seen, we have a good deal of Horizon 3 open. It would have been impossible to work the site at all without these bulldozers and backhoes.
Initially, we recognized that experts other than archaeologists were needed to study the materials we were finding. As a result, the project was set up as an interdisciplinary one, which involved geologists, paleontologists, botanists, and climatologists in addition to the archaeologists. Many of the studies are presently underway, which will make it possible to reconstruct the climate and the environment for the last 10,000 years. This information will enhance our understanding of the conditions under which the early hunting cultures of Iowa lived.
The 3 major areas uncovered were labeled Cultural Horizons 1, 2, and 3. 3 separate levels representing 3 periods of occupation. Each successive area was approximately 6 feet below the one above. The workers were uncovering an ancient
Cherokee
alluvial
Suicide
fan.
is located on an alluvial fan, which is a physiographic form which has been developed by depositing material from the adjacent uplands into the edge of the valley, and it grades down and meets the modern floodplain off to the east here.
Alluvial fan development can be more easily seen in this sequence of diagrams. The orange area indicates the buildup of soil washed down from the foothills from the west. Over a period of thousands of years, the landscape continually changes, providing new areas for groups of hunters to camp.
The modern soil is by far the most well-developed soil profile that's apparent in the fan. Now, the fan is built up from the bottom to the top through time, and it's been done intermittently, and what we're living on our present-day surface is just the most recent deposition of material that came down from the highlands off to the west here and was deposited here at the foot of the slope. We're located at Horizon 2, which was dated at about 7,400 years ago, and we can see here that it's been divided into two parts. The lower part, which had wood remains and a few bones but no cultural remains, an intervening silty material, which is sterile of any cultural materials, and then about 10 centimeters of organically enriched material, a top of a soil on the previous surface, in which we're finding bones and artifacts, and this was a zone which was dated as 7,400 years ago. We can see here, as we move across, that the excavation has already proceeded past in this area, and that they are not going into the lower horizon, which is not yielding artifacts.
Once the overburden was removed, each horizon was gridded in 1 meter squares and mapped to ensure that the location of any material recovered could be reconstructed later. 1 or 2 people excavated in each square using trowels, dental tools, and brushes. Soil was removed from around each bone or artifact, leaving the item on a dirt pedestal. In the areas where it was apparent that there were few, if any, bones or artifacts, an alternative excavation technique called shovel skimming was used to more rapidly test and clear squares. Using a square-bladed shovel, thin layers of soil were peeled off the surface until sterile deposits were reached. After excavating down to sterile ground, a string grid divided into 10-centimeter units was placed over the square, and the position of bones and artifacts was recorded on a graph paper and numbered on a prepared form. The bones and artifacts were removed only after a picture was taken of the completed square, and the materials recovered from the squares were placed in bags, marked as to location, and taken to the field laboratory. In the laboratory, the collected materials were carefully cleaned using picks and brushes and then thoroughly washed. The material included cultural artifacts and bones.
At least 8 bison were found on each horizon at the Cherokee site. They ranged in age from fetal or unborn bison, as these examples here, all the way up to very old age individuals. The way that we age the buffalo is by looking at their jaws. This one has his first molar erupted, his second is still in the jaw, making him about 1.5 to 2 years old. Progressing on, we have one with first and second molars. The third is still in the jaw, still forming. This is perhaps 2.5 years old. Then they range all the way up to very old individuals that have lost some of their teeth, that have very pitted looking teeth and very little enamel left. The age tells us one important thing about the site, and that is the season that they were killed. Because of the fetal bone and because of the ages, we can say that the bison were killed at Cherokee in the late winter. Now, we know that they were killed for food. This leg bone shows some marks that were made by a bone chopper, probably a tool such as this. These were made during the butchering process, breaking up the skeleton and taking off the meat. We also have found dog-like individuals, ranging in size from this coyote up to a larger or wolf-size individual. This jaw is from a modern wolf. This is the one we found at Cherokee. When we compare the two jaws, we see that the Cherokee individual is a much shorter-jawed or shorter-faced individual, therefore suggesting that he was indeed a dog. When we look at limb bones, we have bones from the large individuals at Cherokee, both normal and diseased. You can see that this growth is quite extensive. It would have made it very difficult for this animal to hunt. He therefore must have been either a tolerated camp follower or indeed a domestic dog.
He tied up this time.
To provide additional information for a more accurate reconstruction of the environment, a 1-liter sample of dirt was collected from each square, marked according to its location within the excavation site, and taken to water screens to be floated for snails. The term floating means that the small items, such as snails, are suspended by stirring the soil in water. Floating particles are then poured into a fine mesh screen where the items can be concentrated. After excavation, soil from special features, such as hearths, was also shoveled into plastic bags and floated for snails and seeds.
What we're doing here is identifying the snails that we've recovered from our soil samples. This is the final step before we reach the interpretive stage. We've started out, of course, by taking soil samples from each of the excavation squares and from each of the stratigraphic units. These are processed by flotation, by water screening, and then the snails, which have floated from the soil matrix, are brought here to be picked from the matrix and to be identified and placed in these little vials. The next step, of course, will be the interpretation of what we've learned from it. Now, not all of the snails that we're working on are from the archaeological site. We also try to collect samples of the modern snails from this locality. The only way that we can really interpret the prehistoric ones is by knowing the context in which the modern ones live. It seems likely that there has been an impoverishment of the fauna, that there are fewer snails here today than there were in prehistoric times. Some of that is a consequence of man's activities. Farming, ranching, all limit the number of gastropods that one has, so that we have only a small assemblage compared to the prehistoric ones. And we hope to create a sufficiently large sample that we can compare changes in size of gastropods as well as changes in species composition. Every particular form grows to its optimal size under optimal environmental conditions. And by trying to find out where that exists, what that location is, we can then take the characteristics of the climatic conditions of that region and project it back into the past. We may find, for example, that the archaeological site is comparable to Minnesota, or more specifically, northern Minnesota, in some of the prehistoric horizons. Then we can say that the climate in this portion of Iowa resembled that of Minnesota some 8,000 years ago.
In the interdisciplinary approach, the snail studies add considerable evidence to support other findings at the site.
I suppose they're not any more important than anything else that you might find, but they happen to be here in abundance. And one needs various kinds of indicators of climatic conditions that are reasonably abundant. If you don't have large numbers, your interpretations are very speculative. And since we do have snails in quantity, we can come up with answers that are reasonably good.
The rest of the dirt taken from the squares was marked and taken to an area adjacent to the water screens where it was dried on black plastic tarps and then water screened for small mammal bones and whatever else appeared, from seeds to large snails and chips of stone.
The screening technique was designed to collect items that the archaeologists would miss in the individual squares. Of the material collected from the screens, we find small artifacts, lithics, snails, and small vertebrates. Typical of the small vertebrates collected from one of these screens would be this catfish jaw. This jaw undoubtedly came from the Little Sioux River and tells us that during the time that the site was occupied, that the Little Sioux River was flowing all year long. In addition to the fishes, we also have remains of birds and mammals. The tree squirrel, along with a tree bat and a chipmunk, tells us that there was a wooded area in the region of the site. In addition to these woodland mammals, we also found quite a variety of prairie species, here represented by this ground squirrel. Ground squirrels, as you probably know, inhabit open country today, and they're generally regarded as prairie species. You'll notice on this diagram that we've divided the small mammals, which have to live in the area all year long. They don't migrate in or out, as do the bison. That on horizon 3, 8,400 years before present, the woodland species, relatively speaking, are more abundant than the prairie species. At 7,300 years before present, horizon 2 time, we notice that the number of woodland species decreases and there's a corresponding increase in the number of prairie species. At 6,300 years before present, horizon 1 time, you'll notice that there's a rapid decrease in the number of woodland species and a corresponding explosion, if you like, of prairie species occurring at that time, telling us that through the period of occupation, that a woodland-dominated forest along the stream gradually changed to a prairie-dominated region.
Out on the archaeological site, we've seen how excavation units are dug in small squares. In the squares, we've seen how bones are scattered across the cultural horizon, but not so obvious is the fact that there are little chips of stone and other items that we call lithics, meaning stone, which were left behind by the Indians. And they used to use these things as sharp edges on stone points or scraper type flakes. And these things were scattered about when the site was abandoned. These are very useful to the archaeologist in order to reconstruct what has happened. We've had the question asked, were these cultural layers the result of a single period of occupation? Did a large group come in and conduct a communal kill? Or were the cultural layers the result of a long period of occupation and reoccupation of the sites? And in order to answer these questions, we have to take a look at a wide variety of materials, including the lithic artifacts. And we have to sort these things by the color and kind of stone, and we begin to get some patterns. One pattern that we found on one of the cultural horizons that we call number 1 was that the stone type that predominated was not of a local origin. It came from southwestern Iowa and had to have been carried up in the area. We determined from studying this material that seemed to overlap all of the areas of activity, including hearths and areas where bison bones were disarticulated, stripped of meat, broken, and so forth. We discovered that this stone seemed to be everywhere, and it tended to link our excavation unit together and made us feel that, at least in the area where we were investigating, the deposit was the result of a single occupation. So that's one kind of information that you can get from studying the lithic materials.
From 3 separate levels of the Cherokee site, spear points, knives, and hide scrapers, all representative of the different cultures who use them. Also, 3 articles not necessarily characteristic, but found on each horizon and providing further insight to strengthen the reconstruction. A bone flute fragment, the oldest found in the United States from 6,300 years ago. A milling stone fragment from 7,400 years ago. And an antler tool from the late Paleo-Indian era, almost 8,400 years old.
The objectives of the pollen and seed analysis are to reconstruct the past vegetation of the Cherokee region during the time of occupation by Paleo-Indians. The distribution of plants is controlled by climate, and therefore we also get a record of the past climatic history of the region. The most abundant kind of plant fossil we find is pollen. The pollen is produced by plants, is blown around by the wind, and is deposited over the landscape. It is preserved principally in lake and bog sediments. Unfortunately, no pollen was preserved at the Cherokee site. In nearby lakes, however, we have sediments and pollen accumulating yearly at the lake bottom. The pollen in these sediments represents the vegetation that grows within a radius of 30 to 50 miles around the lake. Therefore, the pollen represents the past vegetation around the lake. The pollen is identified by looking at slides, such as these here, with pollen from modern plants on them. We have chosen Lake Okoboji, some miles north of Cherokee, for our detailed studies.
Similar to the information found in the study of small mammal bones, the record based on the data received from the analysis of pollen in lake sediments indicates that prior to 7,700 years ago, the pollen is primarily from trees. From 7,700 to 6,200 years ago, pollen from species of grasses and herbs are predominant. This information corresponds with the results from the study of small mammal bones and again is indicative of encroachment of the prairie from the west, displacing the forest.
I suppose one of the most important inputs from the study at the Cherokee site is because the fact that so very many different types of scientists and specialists worked on the project trying to figure out and determine from the various types of data what the climate was really like and the physical environment was like during the time of Cherokee occupation between about 8,000 and about 6,000 years ago, very roughly. What we've tried to do is to take all these various types of data, use the computer as an integrator, and summarize all those data from the geologist, the soil scientist, the archaeologist, and whatever, to get the best possible picture of what the environment was like at the time of Cherokee occupation. And we've used the computer for that purpose. One of the things that we have found very generally is that the climate during the time of occupation was generally warmer and drier than the Great Plains are at the present time. This comes about from the various types of information that I mentioned before, and very interestingly, it agrees with other types of data which have been published over the past several years from North America and Western Europe. It appears that during the time of Cherokee occupation, the winds aloft in the high troposphere were much stronger than what they were today, with the result that Pacific air was carried over the Rocky Mountains, losing its moisture on the mountains and coming over the Great Plains as a relatively dry but warm air mass. And because of this, the trees which had been in that region prior to about 8,500 years ago desiccated.
Based on the information obtained from the interdisciplinary approach used at Cherokee, an artist's conception provides a visual representation of the various activities associated with discoveries on all 3 horizons at the site. During the late winter and early spring, hunters stalking and killing the bison. The butchering process. The breaking up of bison bones and, using stone tools, the scraping of the hides. Also depicted are domestic dogs and a group of hunters gathered around a hearth. The composite drawings represent activities that may have occurred in the Cherokee area over a period of roughly 9,000 years.
The purpose of our excavations here at the Cherokee Suicide has been to collect a wide variety of different kinds of data. The data that we have collected, we believe, will shed light on the cultural and the climatic and the environmental history of this area. Our plan is to interpret this data in such a way that the site will be a useful station for comparison with other archaeological sites as well as paleoecological sites. We expect that in future years the site may be revisited by archaeologists. Since we have only excavated a small portion of it, it should provide an ongoing resource for this kind of information. The site has been placed on the National Register of Historic Places, and its protection and preservation is assured. The kinds of information that we will be getting from the site will be useful to scientists in many different fields, as well as to humanists who are interested in the story of man and his interaction with the environment throughout the lengthy past periods. We have a period covered here at this site of somewhere around 9,000 years. Most of this time, man was a hunter. To the layman, the period is very much unknown. One of the benefits of this kind of excavation...
The Earth continues to hold many secrets. Secrets which could perhaps help man answer many of his questions about his environment, his climate, his past. But archaeological investigations, such as Cherokee, conducted as interdisciplinary studies, help to uncover these secrets and continue to expand man's knowledge about himself and the world in which he lives.